Power always thinks it has a great soul and vast views beyond the comprehension of the weak, and that it is doing God's service when it is violating all his laws. John Adams. Good morning, everybody. This is your favorite aspiring revolutionary here, a wandering author, reminding you that we are all the authors of our own lives. As always, my message remains the same. Spend less, live more, earn your freedom with frugality. Today we're in Maryland. That's the Savage River sitting there behind me, or should I say flowing behind me. And we are in Savage River State Forest, in the western part of Maryland. And I gotta tell you guys, Maryland's been a really cool state. This morning I started off my day by doing some skating on a paved path, greenway, and it runs along the Potomac River, I believe, the one that George Washington crossed. And I was able to clean out my car entirely, reconsolidate everything, so that was great. We will be talking today about Athens again, like we did yesterday. We'll be moving forward in the story. It's just the best, the material that I have on hand, so I can actually create notes whenever we're doing these videos in the middle of nowhere where I have no reception. But the campgrounds are abundant here. Like Michigan was similar, where you could just find a camping spot and they were all had fire rings, and it's like that here in Maryland, where you could just find a campsite very easily. It's totally free. So definitely recommend you guys coming through Maryland. I wasn't even aware that I was going to cross through Maryland, but I've really been liking it. Anyways, so yesterday we finished our discussion of Athens by talking about how Athens got their original democracy as a result of a Spartan king who invaded them, right? And he overthrew a tyrant that was running Athens basically as like a mafia style businessman mafioso dude. Now, after Spartan king Cleomenes the first expelled Hippias, which yesterday I said Hipparchus, that was Hippias' brother, so I apologize about that. Athens was essentially a client of the Spartans, so they weren't free. They could run their own government, but they kind of responded to the Spartans' beck and call, at least at the beginning, right? Now, in 509 BCE, an Athenian aristocrat, Isagoras, would attempt to reinstate the old guard's oligarchy, but Isagoras' main opponent, Cleisthenes, proposed radical reforms to curry favor with the people. He was basically running on a platform, and to me it sounded just like, almost like what you would hear Bernie Sanders or somebody like that saying, or even FDR back in the day. He was campaigning on what he called isonomia, which just translate to like fair share or equitable divisions. And basically the tenets of his platform was to renew the power structure so that it was no longer based off of your birth. Like the Eupatridae would no longer be the ones that were in power. Just like in Rome, whenever the patricians were taken over by the plebeians during the social conflict, or the conflict of the orders. Now, Herodotus writes in his book Histories that the Archaic Council refused submission to the Spartans. And this right here was a council of hoplites, which were common people, but they were still like the middle upper class. Now, if you've ever seen 300, the movie, a hoplite is like the badass Spartan warriors. They would fight together in those phalanx formations. So these guys kind of refused to just accept what the upper echelon of society told them was their new order, which was to serve the Spartans. Cleisthenes promised about his fair share isonomia, and this sparked a wave of revolutionary unrest, ultimately bringing him into power, thanks to the violent actions of the hoplites. He followed through on his word whenever he got into office, though, contrary to our current politicians, right? And he transformed Athens into what was called a democratia, which is Greek for people power, literally. That's the literal translation. And so Sparta will continue to try and reestablish their hegemony, but they never are able to overrun the Athenians the way that they did before, and they actually suffer a couple of humiliating defeats. And it establishes them as the second competing power, like the main power. Throughout most of history, there are tons of city-states, but the two main ones are Athens and Sparta. And they kind of come head and head sometimes, you know. And so right now, Athens is starting to be on the ascendant, they're on the rise. They are an ascendant city-state. So in 506, Athens successfully fends off a two-pronged invasion, defeating Sparta to the south and Boeotia to the north, who's Boeotia, another city-state that was known for their hoplites. Sparta unites with Corinth later on to try one last time, but the Corinthians end up reneging on the deal, like they feel like it's unfair to the Athenians, and their king, Demaratus, turned heel, and his troops left with him. And then Sparta was just unable to seal the deal whenever they actually had to fight Athens. Funnily enough, Sparta ends up passing some legislation to limit people's ability to where they could not have two kings at the same time, because that whole fiasco was caused by one king turning heel and running whenever they had two in power. Now, if you guys remember from the Romans, that's totally the opposite of the way the Romans did it. They always had two consuls. Maybe that's why Rome took over Sparta and not the other way around. Two leaders better than one. These early victories emboldened the fledgling Athenian democracy, but the tensions will continue to simmer and continually reignite between Sparta and Athens for another 150 years. Now, Cleisthenes' new constitution gives us a unique glimpse at a historical science experiment. Like I've mentioned a few times in this series, at that point in time, like today, we kind of have this idea about how democracy works. And like most European countries and America, we're all relatively similar, even if we speak different languages and we live in different places. Back then, it wasn't quite the same. They had very different constitutions because the whole idea of government was brand new, basically. Now, an even crazier thing to think about is it's hard for us. Each generation comes of age surrounded, influenced, and governed by a particular set of institutions. And we grow up and that's all we know. Nowadays, none of us can hardly imagine a world without the Senate, the Supreme Court, and like the president. But what we see in Athens is an entire generation of people that never had those concepts and now they're given them. So an entire generation of Archaic Greeks were given a renewed institutional framework, one that had never been tried anywhere yet. Attica, which is basically Greater Athens, was divvied up into three sections. Parishes were established, basically counties, and a novel representational system was implemented. Everybody was kind of allotted into tribes, and these tribes had little counselors, and they would represent the people, very similar to what we see here in America even today. Now, overall, Cleisthenes' new order swept away land and kin-based loyalties, replacing them with the state. So, before, people birth eupatridae, like the ones of good fathers is what they called them back then. The aristocracy, the oligarchy, there's a million different words for it, but I'm pretty sure you know what I'm saying. Those were the people who were always in power, and if there was a monarch, he only stayed in power if he kept the eupatridae, the patricians, the aristocrats happy. Now, aristocratic privilege is never going to recover fully in Athens after these changes. So if you're an oligarch, it kind of sucks for you, I'm sorry. But average everyday people do benefit greatly as a result of these changes. As soon as the new state of Athens is formed, it begins to expand aggressively. They established clerici colonies, which is where they would send non-citizens, and it benefited them. Athens also begins to employ its first citizen army based on the recently introduced tribal representation system. And the way it works is pretty straightforward. Each tribe would donate men, equipment, and horses but there is one thing I noticed when reading through Herodotus's histories: generalship. It's totally means tested. You have to be, if you remember last time we talked how like the Constitution created four formal social classes based on income. So you couldn't be a general unless you were in the top 2. It'd be like if only Bezos and Warren Buffett were able to be the generals of our armies. So, but the generals are elected, so the regular people at least get to elect which of their overlords they're going to be following into battle. Now, could you imagine the IRS limiting promotions because you didn't earn enough? Kind of sus, right? Hashtag sus. Generals could be executed by the Democratic Assemblies too. So it wasn't totally just like the generals had free reign over their people. In 406, there's actually 6 generals who all get killed because the People's Assembly decide that they want them dead. I think there was some kind of military failure fiasco. So there was a very real risk and reward payoff for these guys. Now, the democratic councils that Cleisthenes used, he makes them way more powerful. These were around slightly before him, but he takes them up to 500 people total. Each tribe supplies 50 of them. And counselors were elected, and they had term limits, which is pretty cool. Actually, think about what life would be like if we lived in a place like this. So anybody who could prove they belonged to the deme, which is the Greek word for tribe, and was over the age of 30 could be elected, but nobody could serve more than twice in a lifetime. And each term was only 1 year long. As a result of this, practicalities meant that in general, only the well-to-do people could hold political office. But as a result of these strict term limitations, up to 25% of the adult male Athenian population over 30 would have had some experience holding political office. So I want you to think about that. Imagine if we lived in a country where a quarter of everybody in our country had been a senator or a representative. Hashtag perspective, right? It definitely kept people engaged, and we see that in like the philosophers, Aristotle writes an entire book called Politics, throughout his whole entire Nicomachean Ethics, politics. For the enlightened Greek citizen of the time, like what the ideas that were in vogue was public life was important. People were meant to participate in their governments and stuff, you know? And I mean, it seems like a pretty cool experiment, right? Could you imagine participating in our government? Now, because of these political office term limitations, the people with real power end up becoming the generals. So generalship is highly coveted, even more so than usual, because it was an electable position and it didn't have these term limits. So if you got people to really like you, you could just be reelected and reelected and reelected. Wealthy people could spend an entire lifetime canvassing for office. And the term limits are repealed in Athens towards the 3rd century BCE, and this allows actual political careers to start flourishing for the first time. And the ultimate result is we see a democracy with legislative people technically in the people's hands, but advisory power is pretty much restricted among the elite. Empowered people. Another huge effect of the Cleisthenes reforms is that he gave unheard of power, opportunity, and influence to the average male Athenian. Before this time, they had no say. Within 100 years, the assemblies that we were just talking about are meeting up to 40 times a year, which is 4 times more often than they were before Cleisthenes' reforms were implemented. These actual meetings help to develop and foster rhetoric, which is like the science of persuasion, being able to impress people, impart ideas upon them, and gain their respect becomes highly influential, valuable, and worthy. And it's even respected highly, but it's one of the virtues in the Nicomachean Ethics. So having all of this coordination and stuff at the highest level really changed the way people interacted with each other. And the assemblies were able to tally votes by raising their hands, instead of acclamation, which is way more democratic, and they also had the ability to secretly ostracize an individual for 10 years. So they would do this if they felt like somebody was about to overthrow the republic, basically. If somebody started to amass too much economic or political power, the working class people could just vote and kick them out. So imagine like if we all were just like, you know what, screw Bezos, let's send him to Africa, let's get him out of here. And we could just vote and have him do that. The Athenians could do that. Now, that being said, only 15 ostracism occur over the next 70 years, so it's a seldom used power. And then just a little bit more, which, by the way, next time we talk about these guys, which could be tomorrow, we'll be talking about Sparta instead of Athens. But these new constitutional changes clarified the merits of citizenship. All Athenians start registering with their deme, the tribe, at the age of 18, and before long, people use their deme's name as like a nickname for themselves. So it'd be like so my birth town's Pinson. It'd be like, instead of blank blank, my last name, instead of a wandering author, it'd be like a wandering author of Pinson. These practices further hardened the line that was developing between citizens and metoikos, which is the Greek word for immigrant. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Medics is what we'll call them, could not own land, and they needed a citizen sponsor in court. So they had to have a buddy take them to court if they needed to go to Athenian court. Athens does develop the Acropolis as a meeting space for the first time now. And then, just a retrospective, democracy overtook Athens on the wings of a working class revolution. Had the hoplites failed to repulse Cleomenes' invasion, Athens may very well have remained a Spartan satellite for years to come. But because the everyday people below, and we'll see this as a repeated pattern throughout history, it was the people at the lowest level of society, or at least below the top, that organized and started to gain power for themselves. I forget where the quote's from, but power is never given, it's always taken. And if there's an unequitable power distribution, the people who are the sufferers of this inequities are the ones who must rise up and reassert their rights, which is our first takeaway. So takeaways for our study with Athens: the people demanded a right to navigate their political future, and they gained it because they demanded it. Poor people were gradually being equalized, incorporated, and repatriated, which is another pattern that we will see throughout history. Nations grow great whenever they empower their poorest people. Hashtag facts. Wealth and income continue to play a huge role. Like, even though there was actual political offices and elections, the top offices were restricted to the two highest income brackets. Imagine if there was income requirements for our senators and representatives. Kind of sus. And then, finally, disbanding a stagnant old order paved the way for refreshed growth. Leaving everything in the hands of an old, boring aristocracy was not benefiting Athens at the time, and replacing them really helped them out. So, yeah, that's really all I've got for you guys today. We're in Maryland in Savage River State Forest. I was able to shave today, cleaned out my car entirely, also got an oil change. Now, as a result of all that, I've only walked about 5 miles today instead of my goal of 10 per day. But seems like there's going to be some great camping prospects around here, so I should be able to get plenty more hiking done this weekend. And I have started to really work on my content planning schedule, and I've got a pretty a good idea of like where I'm going to be going over the next few days. So Pennsylvania next, through New York on like the upper head, and I'm going to stay in like the lower populated areas out here. So yeah, I will return as always. My message remains the same: spend less, live more. This is a wandering author reminding you that we are all the authors of our own lives. What are you guys doing in order to inspire, uplift, and empower your communities today? Because this world isn't changing unless we all do our part. You can count on me to do mine daily. Until next time, I love y'all.